Hey everyone, and welcome back to Fact Check Simplified. Today, we're talking about that time when getting sick became a popularity contest, and your hospital bill started looking like a Kickstarter campaign for a really terrible indie film where the main character just dies if they don't hit their funding goal. We're diving into the absolute chaos engine that is medical crowdfunding. Think of it as the world's worst startup pitch meeting gone global, where venture capitalists are replaced by your distant relatives on Facebook, and the product is your continued existence. This whole mess is a tangled web of economic policy, tech disruption, and good old-fashioned desperation. So please forgive me if I oversimplify this dumpster fire into something that fits into your commute. It is either this or a 400-page congressional report that uses the word synergies unironically before the inevitable corporate betrayal starts. If you enjoy this highly dramatic but fun version of modern facts, please hit that like and subscribe button. Seriously, it helps us pay the electric bill for our overpriced standing desks. All right, grab an iced latte. Things are about to get unnecessarily infuriating. Let's set the scene. Wind the clock back. No, further. Past the invention of the selfie stick, before social media was a full-time job. We land in the hazy, nostalgically filtered era of the late 20th and early 21st century. The before times. The American healthcare system was already a legend, but not in a good way. It was more like a local cryptid that everyone knew existed, but nobody wanted to talk about at dinner parties. It was a creature of myth and immense power, cobbled together with red tape, fax machines, and the salty tears of anyone who'd ever tried to read an explanation of benefits statement. The central promise of this era was a beautiful, shimmering fairy tale. It went something like this: you work hard, you get a good job, and that good job comes with the benefits. Health insurance was the crown jewel of this package deal. It was the golden ticket, the velvet rope that separated the secure and the stable from, well, everyone else. This system wasn't designed, it was accumulated. It was a series of historical accidents and legislative patch jobs that resulted in a teetering architectural marvel of absurdity. Imagine a skyscraper built not on a blueprint, but on a series of sticky notes left by different construction crews over 50 years. That was American healthcare. The foundation of this whole precarious structure was one single, deeply flawed idea: employer-sponsored health insurance. Your access to a doctor, to medicine, to the very concept of not going bankrupt because you slipped on a banana peel, was chained directly to your W-2 form. Your health wasn't a right, it was a corporate perk, nestled somewhere between casual Fridays and a subsidized gym membership. It was a bizarre hostage situation that everyone just collectively agreed to call the norm. We were all just pretending this was fine, totally fine. The Jenga tower of our collective well-being was getting taller, and every block pulled was another corporate merger, another round of layoffs, another company deciding to switch to a cheaper plan with a deductible the size of a small car. This entire setup was a historical fluke that calcified into gospel. Here's the rapid-fire cause and effect that got us here. Cause: during World War II, the government slapped wage controls on companies to stop inflation. Companies, desperate to attract workers, couldn't offer more money, so they got creative. They started offering shiny new benefits, like health insurance, as a loophole to lure in talent. Effect: this accidental solution became the standard. A massive, labyrinthine system exploded into existence, where your boss became the gatekeeper to your cardiologist. Your employer, a company that probably sold lawnmowers or accounting software, was now in the business of negotiating healthcare rates for its employees. Consequence: this arrangement cleaved the country in two. You had the insured, the salaried warriors of corporate America with their neat little insurance cards. And then you had everyone else: the artists, the freelancers, the part-time workers, the small business owners, the unemployed. They were cast out into the wilderness of the individual market. A Mad Max-style hellscape of exorbitant prices, denial of coverage for pre-existing conditions, and enough paperwork to deforest a small country. The system created a brutal class divide based not on wealth, but on employment status. The meta commentary here is just screamingly obvious. The sheer, unadulterated madness of this model is breathtaking. We outsourced the most fundamental human need, the need to be healthy, to the whims of the free market, and more specifically, to the quarterly profit goals of the company you happen to work for. Think about it. The same entity that tracked your keystrokes and could fire you for being 5 minutes late held the keys to your family's medical future. The conflict of interest isn't just a red flag, it's a stadium-sized, pyrotechnic-laden, monster truck rally red flag. Your boss's incentive is to cut costs. Your incentive is to, live. These two goals are not, and have never been, aligned. Yet, for decades, this was the dream being sold. It was the illusion of stability. People planned their lives around it. They took jobs they hated, endured toxic bosses, and commuted for hours. All for the promise of that PPO plan. They stayed in place, terrified to leave, because starting a business or changing careers meant jumping off the insurance cliff. It was a system of control disguised as a benefit. A pair of golden handcuffs. And even inside this gilded cage, the cracks were showing. The term underinsured was already slithering into the lexicon. This was for the folks who had insurance, but whose plans were so riddled with holes, co-pays, and deductibles that a serious illness would still financially ruin them. They were paying a monthly subscription fee for the privilege of still going broke, just slightly slower. Here is a little snapshot to puncture the nostalgia, even at the peak of this supposed golden age. In 2007, just before the floor fell out, the U.S. Census Bureau reported that nearly 46 million Americans were living without any health insurance at all. 1 in 6 people were already playing life on the highest difficulty setting, with no safety net whatsoever. So this was the stage. A fragile, top-heavy system built on a historical accident. A system that conflated employment with survival. A system that was already leaving tens of millions behind while convincing everyone else they were safe. Everyone was just holding their breath, balancing on this tightrope, pretending the ground wasn't miles below. They were pretending the tower wasn't wobbling. They were about to find out what happens when someone kicks the table. And then, in 2008, someone didn't just kick the table, they flipped it over, lit it on fire, and threw it out a 50-story window. The global economy, a finely tuned machine of pure, uncut hubris and nonsensical financial acronyms, face-planted with the grace of a toddler running full speed into a wall. The Great Recession wasn't a gentle downturn, it was a demolition. It was the sound of a million dominoes, all carved from bad mortgages and credit default swaps, clattering into each other in a symphony of economic ruin. Wall Street had built a skyscraper on a sinkhole, and now the whole world was getting sucked down with it. The specifics are a jargon-filled nightmare that financial analysts still argue about. But the gist is this: a bunch of bankers got obscenely rich by gambling with other people's houses. They packaged up risky loans, slapped a fancy label on them, sold them to each other, and pretended these ticking time bombs were solid gold. When the bombs inevitably went off, the entire system froze. The chaos was immediate and absolute. Lehman Brothers, a name that once sounded like unshakable granite, evaporated overnight. The stock market started to resemble a ski slope. Panic wasn't just in the air, it was the air, and for the average person, this abstract financial meltdown had a terrifyingly concrete impact. It started with a whisper, then a rumor, then a company-wide email with a subject line that made your stomach drop. Layoffs, downsizing, restructuring. These were the corporate euphemisms for the brutal reality. The Jenga tower was collapsing. The sacred cow of American stability, the full-time job with benefits, was being led to the slaughterhouse on an industrial scale. This was the moment the fairy tale shattered. The fundamental flaw in chaining healthcare to employment was exposed in the most brutal way imaginable. Cause the financial markets imploded, causing a massive credit crunch that starved businesses of the capital they needed to operate. Effect: companies, from global mega corporations to the local hardware store, initiated panicked, widespread layoffs. Survival mode was activated. Payrolls were slashed. Entire departments vanished. The social contract between employer and employee was shredded and tossed into the incinerator. Consequence: millions upon millions of pink slips were handed out, and each one was a double-barreled shotgun blast to a family security. You didn't just lose your paycheck, you lost your 401k, you lost your peace of mind, and most critically, you lost your health insurance. The golden handcuffs were unlocked, and you were unceremoniously shoved out of the moving car overnight. The carefully constructed illusion of the safe middle class was ripped away. People who had done everything right, went to college, bought a house, worked at the same company for 15 years, were suddenly standing on the edge of the abyss. The number of uninsured Americans, already a national disgrace, began to skyrocket. Here's your snapshot of the carnage. Between 2007 and the end of 2009, the number of uninsured adults climbed by over 5 million people. That's the entire population of Colorado, suddenly without a safety net. Millions of people, in the span of months, were demoted from secure employee to freelancer in the medical Wild West. With no warning and no preparation, this is where the infuriating irony dials up to 11. The architects of this global financial Catastrophe. The Wall Street wizards who played casino with the world's economy got bailouts. The government, in a panic, flooded the banking system with taxpayer money to prevent a total collapse. The institutions deemed too big to fail were propped up, dusted off, and sent back to the party. But for the millions of people who lost their jobs and their healthcare as a direct result of that party, there was no bailout, there was no rescue package. There was just a COBRA application, the program that lets you keep your old insurance if you can suddenly afford to pay the entire, astronomically expensive premium yourself, which, spoiler alert, nobody who just got fired can do. It was the legislative equivalent of telling someone who just fell out of a plane that they were welcome to buy their own parachute for 10 times the normal price. A new, potent kind of fear began to permeate American life. It was a dual-pronged terror. First, the economic anxiety. How do I pay my mortgage? How do I buy groceries? Then came the even more primal fear. What happens if someone gets sick? What happens if my kid breaks their arm? What happens if that weird mole I've been ignoring turns out to be something serious? The buffer was gone. The thin shield of the insurance card, which had always felt so inadequate, now seemed like an impossibly powerful relic from a lost civilization, the healthcare system, which was already a predatory, confusing maze for the insured, became an unbreachable fortress for the newly uninsured. Hospitals demanded cash up front. The price of a simple antibiotic could feel like a car payment. A chronic illness, once manageable, became a potential death sentence. This wasn't just an economic crisis anymore. It was rapidly morphing into a public health catastrophe. The stress of unemployment was now compounded by the terror of medical vulnerability. People started avoiding the doctor, hoping problems would just go away. They split pills to make prescriptions last longer. They prayed. This was the fertile soil of desperation from which a strange new flower would grow. A system had failed, an economy had collapsed, an entire generation's sense of security had been annihilated. People were scared, isolated, and broke. They were facing down 5- and 6-figure medical bills, with nothing but a maxed-out credit card and a dwindling savings account. The old way was broken. The safety nets had been slashed. The government had bailed out the banks, not the people. A void had opened up, a vast chasm of need. And into that void, a new idea was about to be born. An idea that sounded, at first, like a heartwarming solution. An idea that would harness the power of the internet not to sell books or connect with old high school friends, but to do something much, much more primal, to beg for your life. Into this chasm of absolute, bone-deep desperation, a new character entered the stage. It didn't arrive in a suit and tie, carrying a briefcase full of policy papers. It arrived with a clean user interface, a friendly font, and a bright green Donate Now button. In May of 2010, while the economic wreckage of 2008 was still smoldering, a website called GoFund blinked into existence. It wasn't presented as a solution to the American healthcare crisis. Oh, heavens no, it was classic. Early 2010s tech optimism, bottled and sold as a web platform. The pitch was simple, sunny, and profoundly naive. We're democratizing fundraising. We're empowering individuals. We're putting the fun in funding. Its creators envisioned a world where you could use their shiny new tool to raise money for your passion project. You wanted to record an album? Launch a quirky small business selling artisanal pickles? Fund a trip to build a school in a developing country? GoFund was your digital bake sale, your 21st century collection plate. The early campaigns were a wholesome grab bag of humanity's hopes and dreams. Help us pay for our honeymoon. Fund our local animal shelter. Shipping for a new playground. It was about community projects and personal goals. It was for wants, not for life or death. Needs. The platform was a product of its time. The internet was transitioning from a weird place you visited to the very fabric of reality. Social media was hitting its stride. The idea of going viral was intoxicating. Silicon Valley was high on its own supply, convinced that every single one of society's problems, from inefficient taxi services to global poverty, could be solved with a slick app and a clever algorithm. GoFund was born of this same utopian fervor. It promised to connect people, to facilitate generosity, to let the crowd work its magic. It was a tool, and like any tool, it was agnostic. It had no idea what it was about to become, but the America it was born into was not the optimistic, quirky place its creators seemed to be designing for. It was a nation full of people who were one bad diagnosis away from total financial annihilation. The platform, with its simple setup and social media integration, was a loaded gun sitting on a table in a room full of desperate people. And it didn't take long for someone to pick it up. Here is the chain reaction that nobody planned, but everyone should have seen coming. Cause, the post-recession landscape was littered with people facing medical bills that looked like phone numbers, the traditional avenues, bank loans, help from family, charity were exhausted or inadequate. They were out of options, drowning in debt and fear. Effect, a few of these people, seeing GoFundMe used to raise a few $1,000s for a wedding, had a moment of grim inspiration. What if they used it for chemotherapy? What if they put their story there, raw, terrifying, deeply personal medical trauma out there for the world to see? They uploaded a photo from their hospital bed, wrote a heart-wrenching plea, and set a fundraising goal that wasn't for a honeymoon, but for another year of life. Consequence, the formula was accidentally discovered. It turned out that a story of human suffering, combined with the frictionless sharing power of Facebook and a one-click payment system, was a phenomenally potent cocktail. It bypassed the slow, bureaucratic world of traditional nonprofits. It created an immediate, emotional, and deeply personal connection between a stranger in crisis and a potential donor scrolling through their news feed. Digital panhandling was born, and it was shockingly effective. This pivot wasn't a conscious decision made in a boardroom. It was a user-led revolution born of pure necessity. The platform's founders stumbled backward into the biggest, most tragic, and most profitable market in America, the gaping maw of its failed healthcare system. They had built a platform for dreams, and we're about to discover that it worked even better for nightmares. The meta commentary here writes itself. This is the Silicon Valley origin story in its purest, most cynical form. You don't solve the problem, you build a toll booth on the only road out of the disaster zone. GoFundMe didn't set out to fix healthcare, it created a marketplace for survival. It disrupted nothing but the quiet dignity of suffering. It provided a service, yes, but it was a service that should never, ever have to exist in a civilized country. They saw a systemic failure not as a crisis to be solved, but as a total addressable market. The platform's design was unintentionally perfect for this grim new purpose. The progress bar, ticking slowly toward its goal, created a sense of urgency and shared purpose. The list of donors, with their small contributions and encouraging comments, provided social proof and a feeling of community. The campaign updates allowed the sick person to chronicle their battle, turning their treatment into a serialized drama for their followers. It gamified survival. Every donation was a little hit of dopamine, a tiny glimmer of hope. Every share on social media was a pull of the slot machine lever, a chance to go viral and hit the jackpot. This new savior offered a seductive promise, agency. In a system that made people feel utterly powerless, GoFundMe offered a button to push, an action to take. You couldn't negotiate with an insurance company, you couldn't reason with a hospital billing department, but you could write a campaign, you could share it, you could do something. It was a brilliant illusion of control in the face of chaos. It felt like empowerment. It looked like hope, but what it really was the privatization of the social safety net. It was the moment we, as a society, tacitly agreed that if the system lets you fall, your only hope is to hope that you fall entertainingly enough for strangers to throw you a rope. And that tech platform holding the rope, it would be sure to take a small cut for its trouble. And so, the slot machine was built, the levers were in place. All it needed was for someone to hit the jackpot, loudly and publicly, to prove to everyone else that the game was winnable. It didn't take long. Somewhere in the digital chaos of the early 2010s, it happened. The first viral miracle patient was born. This wasn't one person, really, but an archetype, a template that would be copied and pasted into the national consciousness a million times over. The story is always eerily the same. It starts with a normal person living a normal life, a teacher, a mechanic, a young parent, someone relatable. Then, the plot twist from hell arrives, a freak accident, a shocking diagnosis, a genetic betrayal. Life slams into a brick wall at 100 miles an hour. The medical bills that follow are not just large, they are absurd, comical, monopoly money numbers. 100,000 for this surgery, 50,000 for that drug. The insurance company, if one even exists in this particular story, responds with its signature blend of bureaucratic apathy and outright denial. The family drains their savings, maxes out their credit cards, and stares into the void of financial ruin. This is the rock bottom, and from that rock bottom, they make the Hail Mary pass. They start a GoFundMe. Someone, a tech-savvy niece or a determined spouse, crafts the campaign. They write the story, pouring every ounce of pain, fear, and hope into a few hundred words. They choose the photo, the one that will stop a person from scrolling past. Not a smiling, happy before picture, but the raw, unflinching after. The picture from the hospital bed, tubes and wire snaking across the foreground, eyes weary, but still fighting. They set a goal that feels impossible, like typing a wish into a search bar. And they click publish. For the first few days, it's a trickle. Friends donate $50. Family members share it on their Facebook pages with heartfelt pleas. It's the digital equivalent of a church bake sale, raising a few $1,000s. A noble but ultimately futile effort against a six-figure tidal wave of debt. But then, the spark finds kindling. A local news reporter, looking for a human interest story to fill the last 2 minutes of the evening broadcast, stumbles upon the campaign. The story airs. A small city feels a pang of sympathy. Then, the algorithm works its dark magic. The local news segment gets posted online. Someone with 10,000 followers shares it, then someone with 100,000. A minor celebrity, scrolling through their feed in a moment of boredom, retweets the link with a simple "let's help," and that's the explosion. The cascade begins. The campaign page, once getting a few hits an hour, is now getting hundreds a minute. The donation notifications start to ping like a machine gun. $10 from a stranger in Australia, $25 from a student in Ohio, $5 from someone who just writes "I've been there, keep fighting." This is the chain reaction that forged a new American myth. Cause a desperate, perfectly articulated crowdfunding campaign, complete with a compelling narrative and heart-wrenching visuals, gets a lucky break and is amplified by local media and then social media influencers. Effect: donations flood in from a global audience of strangers. The progress bar on the GoFundMe page fills up in a blur of green. The impossible fundraising goal is met, then doubled, then tripled. In a matter of days, the family weeps with relief. The patient gets a second chance. Consequence: the media goes into a frenzy, but they completely missed the point. They frame the story not as a terrifying indictment of a failed state, but as a heartwarming triumph of the human spirit. It's a feel-good story. The narrative is about the kindness of strangers, the power of community, the miracle of the internet. The systemic failure that necessitated this digital begging is treated as a mere plot device, the setup for the inspirational climax. This was the great laundering of a tragedy into an inspiration. The narrator in my head is just screaming at this. We, as a culture, collectively decided to celebrate the firefighter for catching the baby, while completely ignoring the fact that the entire building was a death trap with no fire escapes. Cheering for a viral medical campaign is like applauding the resourcefulness of a man who builds a raft out of garbage to survive a flood. Yes, his ingenuity is impressive, but the real story is the goddamn flood. This viral miracle patient wasn't a hero. They were a refugee of a collapsed system, and their success created the most dangerous illusion of all, the illusion that this was a viable solution. Suddenly, a goal of $250, zero for a liver transplant, no longer seemed like a fantasy. It seemed doable. The lottery had a winner, and their face was all over the news. For the millions of other people drowning in medical debt, this wasn't just a news story. It was a blueprint. It was a step-by-step guide to survival. It whispered a seductive and deadly lie. If your story is sad enough, and if you are lucky enough, strangers on the internet might save your life. The aftermath was a win for everyone, except, in the long run, society. The patient got their treatment. The donors got to feel like heroes for a day. The media got a story with a happy ending. That generated millions of clicks, and GoFundMe got the greatest marketing campaign in history, one that cost them absolutely nothing. They were no longer just a platform, they were a vessel for modern-day miracles. They were the architects of hope. The success of the first viral miracle patient wasn't just a fluke. It was a proof of concept. It proved there was a vast, untapped market for desperation, and a whole new industry was about to boot up to service it. That first viral miracle wasn't a one-off event. It was the starting pistol for a gold rush. And the gold wasn't money. It was something far more valuable in the digital age: clicks, engagement, virality. In the wake of that first success, a powerful and deeply cynical ecosystem roared to life, a machine I like to call the feel-good industrial complex. It was a perfectly symbiotic, parasitic relationship between the media, social media, and the crowdfunding platforms themselves, all fueled by the public's endless appetite for stories of suffering, with a happy, check-sized ending. The media led the charge. News outlets, struggling with the collapse of their old business models, were desperate for cheap, emotionally resonant content that people would actually share. And these stories, they were perfect. They cost almost nothing to produce. The source material was already written on the GoFundMe page. They were emotionally potent, guaranteed to make an audience feel a powerful cocktail of pity, outrage, and ultimately, a warm, fuzzy sense of vicarious generosity. They were, in short, the perfect content for the Facebook era. So, the GoFund beat was born. Every local news station in America now had the default story templates: puppy rescued from well, and community rallies to pay for Timmy's experimental cancer treatment. The segments were cookie cutter, stamped out on an assembly line of manufactured emotion. They'd open with somber piano music. They'd show pictures of the smiling, healthy family from the before times. Then, the tearful interview with a parent, their voice cracking as they recount the moment they got the diagnosis. The reporter, face a mask of practiced empathy, would narrate the family's struggle, and then the triumphant pivot. But then they turned to the internet. The screen would fill with images of the GoFund page, the dollar amount climbing. The segment would climax with the family weeping again, but this time with gratitude, thanking the thousands of strangers who saved them. It was a 3-act play of tragedy and redemption, all neatly packaged in under 3 minutes, just in time for the weather forecast. This is the central scandal, the great collective abdication of duty. The media's job is to explain the world, to hold power accountable, but here, they did the opposite. Cause, media corporations, driven by the need for ad revenue, discovered that heartwarming stories about successful crowdfunding campaigns were a reliable engine for generating clicks and shares. Effect, instead of investigating the root causes why a family in the richest country on earth would need to beg for their child's life, they created a new genre of journalism that celebrated the begging. They developed a repeatable, emotionally manipulative template that focused exclusively on the inspiring outcome. Consequence, this relentless fire hose of feel-good coverage fundamentally warped the public's understanding of the crisis. It reframed a catastrophic failure of public policy as a series of uplifting individual dramas. The narrative wasn't "our system is so broken we've resorted to digital panhandling." The narrative was "look how kind and generous we are when we come together." It was a massive, systemic gaslighting campaign that short-circuited public anger and neutralized any momentum for real political change. The meta commentary here is just dripping with cynicism. The feel-good industrial complex created a perverse feedback loop by celebrating the exceptions, the tiny fraction of campaigns that actually went viral and met their goals. They created more of them. More desperate people, seeing these stories on the news, would be encouraged to start their own campaigns, which in turn created a fresh supply of content for the newsrooms to mine. It was a self-perpetuating content machine that ran on a fuel of human misery, which was then refined into inspirational clickbait. This wasn't just local news. The machine had many parts. Daytime talk shows would fly out the most successful families, parading them on stage to tell their story between a celebrity interview and a cooking segment. Viral content farms like Upworthy and BuzzFeed churned out listicles, 7 GoFund campaigns that will restore your faith in humanity. Even corporations got in on the act, sharing these stories on their social media feeds to perform a hollow pantomime of corporate compassion. It was all part of the same grand illusion, convincing a nation that the gaping holes in its social safety net were actually just opportunities for us all to prove how nice we are. This constant, saccharine media narrative provided the perfect air cover for the crowdfunding platforms themselves. It gave them an invaluable social license to operate. They weren't seen as opportunistic middlemen monetizing desperation. They were portrayed as heroic innovators, facilitators of modern miracles. The media coverage sanitized their entire business model. It allowed them to wrap themselves in the flag of community and generosity, all while the reality of their business was becoming much, much darker. The feel-good industrial complex had tilled the soil, planted the seeds, and watered them with a constant stream of emotionally manipulative content. And now, the platforms were ready for their own altruistic pivot. They were ready to start harvesting, with the feel-good industrial complex providing unlimited, glowing PR. The crowdfunding platforms had all the social permission they needed to lean into their new, grim identity. They had accidentally stumbled upon the most lucrative and tragically evergreen market in America. And now it was time to stop stumbling and start sprinting. It was time for the altruistic pivot. This wasn't an evolution, it was a conquest. The platforms, led by the Goliath, GoFund, made a conscious, data-driven decision to reform their entire business around the machinery of human suffering. The pivot was cold, calculated, and brutally effective. The data was undeniable. Campaigns for honeymoons or indie films might raise a few $1,000s, but a campaign for a child's cancer treatment, that had the potential to pull in hundreds of thousands. The emotional stakes were higher. The urgency was absolute. and the potential for viral spread was off the charts. They realized, in the chilling language of Silicon Valley, that the user engagement on a terminal diagnosis was just fantastic. The click-through rate on "Help Save My Life" was a marketer's dream, so they optimized for tragedy. The friendly, all-purpose fundraising tool was systematically retooled into a hyper-efficient engine for monetizing medical debt. The changes were sweeping. First came the marketing. The GoFundMe homepage, once a colorful mosaic of creative projects, was remade into a hall of fame of survival. The featured campaigns were no longer about opening a bakery. They were about funding a heart transplant. The marketing emails and social media ads were filled with the smiling faces of survivors, their stories of near-death and miraculous rescue presented as testimonials to the platform's power. Then came the product itself. The user interface was redesigned to funnel desperate people into the medical fundraising pipeline. They introduced a prominent new category: medical illness and healing. It wasn't just an option, it was the main event. They began offering resources, tutorials, and blog posts with titles like "Tips for a Successful Medical Fundraiser." They were, with a disturbingly cheerful tone, teaching critically ill people how to be better beggars. They provided templates for how to write the most compelling narrative, advice on which photos to use, and step-by-step guides for how to share your story for maximum social media impact. The subtext was clear: your suffering is a product, and we can help you market it effectively. This is the moment the mask comes off. The scandal isn't just that this was happening, it's that it was a formal business strategy. Cause the platform's internal data revealed that medical campaigns were the single largest and most profitable driver of user traffic, donations, and most importantly, revenue from transaction fees. They executed a strategic pivot, redesigning their product and marketing to specifically attract, encourage, and streamline the creation of medical campaigns. They built a sophisticated funnel to convert sick people into active, high-performing fundraisers. Consequence: this optimization cemented their role as a parasitic, for-profit fixture in the American healthcare landscape. They were no longer a neutral tool. They were an active participant, a shadow insurance company whose only premium was a sufficiently tragic and well-marketed story. By making the process so easy and so normal, they became the path of least resistance for millions, effectively becoming an indispensable part of the problem itself. My inner narrator is just fascinated by the sheer audacity. They took the most terrifying moment in a person's life and turned it into a user journey to be optimized. They A/B tested pathos. They ran analytics on anguish. The language of tech conversion rates, user funnels, key performance indicators was now being applied to a parent trying to raise money for their child's leukemia treatment. What's the LTV, the lifetime value of a patient with a chronic illness who might need to run multiple campaigns over several years? It's the most cynical business model imaginable, wrapped in a rainbow-colored blanket of corporate empathy speak. The results of this pivot were staggering. Here's your snapshot. By 2018, the medical category wasn't just a part of GoFundMe. It was the beating heart of its business, accounting for 1 in 3 of all campaigns on the site, and having raised at that point over $5 billion. Billions with a B. Imagine being that person. You've just been diagnosed. You're terrified. The doctor has given you a number that might as well be the distance to the moon. You go home, and someone suggests you try GoFundMe. You pull up the site, and what do you see? You see a webpage that understands you. It speaks your language. It anticipates your fears. Start your fundraiser, it says, with a picture of a smiling, healthy person who was once just like you. We're here to help. It reassures you. Every button, every sentence, every design choice is engineered to make this horrifying, humiliating process feel normal, hopeful, and proactive. It's a masterclass in user experience design, applied to the process of begging for your life. This calculated pivot had a profound consequence. By optimizing their platforms for tragedy, they created a brutal new reality. If crowdfunding is now a finely tuned marketplace, then patients are no longer just people in need of help. They are products, they are brands, and in any marketplace, products must compete. The platforms had built a beautiful, efficient, and user-friendly arena. And into that arena, the sick and the desperate were about to be thrown, forced to fight for the attention and sympathy of the crowd. The platforms had built the arena, the media had sold the tickets, and now the sick and the desperate were pushed through the gates, blinking in the harsh digital sunlight. They quickly discovered that this new game of survival had a new, invisible, and brutally impartial referee: the algorithm. The old gatekeepers of healthcare, the insurance adjusters in their drab cubicles, the hospital billing departments with their endless phone trees, were being replaced by a far more powerful and unknowable force. The algorithm was your new primary care physician, your new insurance panel, your new god. And this god was not merciful. It was hungry. It fed on clicks, shares, and engagement. In this new world, your survival was no longer contingent on the severity of your diagnosis or the strength of your doctor's recommendation. Those were secondary details, flavor text. Your survival now depended on your ability to write a compelling marketing pitch for your own continued existence. You were the product, the brand, and the chief marketing officer of your own life or death campaign. The skills required to succeed were not medical, they were commercial. The rules of this new, cruel game became clear very quickly. Rule number 1, your story is everything. A vague "I'm sick and need help" was a digital death sentence. You needed a narrative. You needed a hero. You needed a villain, the disease, the insurance company, the universe. You needed a ticking clock, a clear financial goal, and a heart-wrenching call to action. You had to be a master storyteller, transforming your private terror into a public epic that could compete with 1,000 other dramas flooding people's news feeds. Rule number 2, aesthetics matter. A blurry, poorly lit photo from your hospital bed was amateur hour. To truly move the needle, you needed high-quality, emotionally resonant visuals. A heartbreaking video, professionally edited with sad background music, was even better. You had to curate the visual brand of your suffering, making it just palatable enough to be shared, just shocking enough to be memorable. It was the ultimate grotesque Instagram challenge. Rule number 3, you must become a social media guru overnight. Your success was now a function of your digital marketing acumen. Did you use the right hashtags? Did you post your updates during peak traffic hours? Did you create a Facebook group for your followers? Did you know how to tag local news outlets and minor celebrities in your posts? You weren't just a patient anymore. You were a content creator, a community manager, and a digital strategist, all while trying to manage a chemo schedule and crippling medical anxiety. This is the fundamental, world-breaking scandal of the algorithmic age of healthcare. A new, terrifyingly unjust system of resource allocation had emerged from the digital ether. Cause, the algorithms governing crowdfunding and social media platforms are programmed to amplify content that generates the most engagement, as this is a proxy for user interest and ultimately ad revenue. Effect, a medical campaign's success became inextricably linked to its virality. Its ability to generate likes, shares, and comments became a more significant factor in its success than the patient's actual medical need or financial desperation. Consequence, this created a new, vicious hierarchy of the sick. A photogenic young couple whose baby needs a heart transplant will almost always get more algorithmic attention than a lonely, elderly man with a less shareable form of cancer. A person with a large, wealthy, and tech-savvy social network has a massive, often insurmountable, advantage over someone who is poor and isolated. Survival became a function of your social capital and marketing skills. The narrator in my soul wants to just sit down and weep at the sheer dystopian insanity of it all. We have successfully outsourced life and death medical decisions to a system that was originally designed to show you ads for sneakers based on your browsing history. The algorithm doesn't know you have stage 4 cancer. It just knows that your last post only got 12 likes and a sad face emoji from your aunt. It doesn't care that you need $50,000 for a drug that will keep you alive. It just sees that a video of a cat falling off a table is getting more traction. Your FICO score used to determine your financial future. Now, your cloud score, your invisible, ever-changing social media influence could determine whether you had a future at all. This turned every campaign into a frantic, 24/7 job, while your body was at war with itself. Your mind had to be focused on analytics. Why did my Tuesday update get more shares than Thursday's? Should I post another picture of the medical bills to create a sense of urgency? I need to do a Facebook Live from the infusion center to really connect with my donor base. This is the language of marketing, the cold calculus of commerce, being applied to the most vulnerable moments of a human life. It's a system that punishes the meek, the private, the unphotogenic, the digitally illiterate, and the simply exhausted. It's a system that declares, with chilling finality, that if you cannot make your suffering go viral, then perhaps your suffering doesn't matter. The algorithm will see you now. But if your numbers aren't good enough, it will quickly look away. The algorithm demanded a show, and so the patients, with no other choice, became performers. This was the next, logical, and most grotesque stage of the evolution. It was no longer enough to simply be sick. You had to perform sick. You had to take your private, messy, terrifying reality and repackage it into a compelling, shareable, and most importantly, profitable public performance. You had to become the star, director, and producer of the world's most tragic reality show, Your Own Illness. The content the algorithm craved was raw, emotional, and constant. Silence was death. If you went quiet for a week because you were too sick or too depressed to post, the algorithm would assume your story was over. You'd be buried, forgotten. To stay relevant, to stay alive, you had to feed the beast a steady diet of your own pain. This meant constant updates. A post after every doctor's visit. A new photo every time a new, horrifying bruise appeared. A detailed, almost clinical description of the side effects of your latest treatment. Your medical chart became your content calendar. Then came the demand for radical, soul-bearing transparency. Privacy was the first thing to be sacrificed at the altar of the algorithm. To prove the stakes were real, you had to show the receipts literally. It became standard practice to post photos of the medical bills themselves, with their phone number size totals circled in red. You'd post screenshots of the insurance company's denial letter. You'd share your lab results. You were expected to turn over every private, humiliating document of your ordeal as proof of your worthiness. Your life was no longer your own. It was an open book for strangers to read, judge, and decide whether or not to bookmark. The new reality was surreal and deeply unsettling. A young woman live streaming her chemotherapy session from the infusion chair. A link to her GoFundMe in her TikTok bio, hoping a trending sound would help her pay for the very poison being pumped into her veins. A father doing a Facebook Live from the hospital cafeteria, giving a tearful update on his child's surgery, while trying to remember all the marketing bullet points he needed to hit. It was a 24/7's performance of suffering, a constant tightrope walk between being vulnerable enough to elicit sympathy and strong enough to seem like a worthy investment. This is the dark heart of the business model, the unspoken policy that drives the entire machine. It's the rise of what you could call desperation porn, cause in a competitive digital marketplace. A patient's campaign needs a constant stream of highly engaging content to stay visible. The most engaging content is often the most graphic, personal, and emotionally raw. Effect, patients are incentivized, both by the platform's design and by watching other successful campaigns, to perform their suffering. They must effectively commodify their trauma, turning their private battle into a public spectacle to attract and retain donors. Consequence, this systematically destroys the dignity and privacy of the sick. The boundary between patient and performer evaporates. It creates an immense psychological burden, forcing people to not only endure their illness, but also to cure it and market it, all while managing the emotions of an online audience of investors who expect a return on their donation in the form of an inspiring story. The narrator voice in my head just keeps asking, who are we? The audience. In all of this, we scroll through these stories, sandwiched between a meme and a vacation photo. Is it pure altruism that makes someone donate, or is there a sliver of voyeurism, a morbid curiosity, a transaction where we pay a few dollars to feel the catharsis of someone else's tragedy, to feel grateful for our own health, to feel like a good person, and then to scroll on? This system doesn't just implicate the platforms, it implicates the consumers. The demand for these stories is what makes them so profitable. We are the ones watching the show. The emotional labor involved was crushing. On top of everything else, you had to be the perfect victim. You had to be brave. You had to be inspiring. You had to be endlessly, performatively grateful for every $5 donation. You couldn't be angry. You couldn't be bitter. You couldn't be too depressing, lest your donors decide you were a lost cause. You had to maintain the brand of the fighter, the warrior. You were not allowed to simply be a terrified human being who was in pain. You were playing a role, and if you broke character, the funding might dry up. Imagine the sheer psychic damage. You're fighting for your life, and in parallel, you're managing an online fundraising campaign that feels like a full-time job you can never quit. You're taking selfies that show your hair falling out, hoping it will be good for another few $100s. You're crafting the perfect, heart-wrenching sentence to describe your pain. You are selling your vulnerability, piece by piece, penny by penny, in the desperate hope that you can buy yourself a little more time. This wasn't a side effect of the system. This was the system, working as intended. It was a perfect, horrifying machine for turning pain into cash. And all the while, the old gatekeepers, the architects of the original broken system, were watching this chaotic new marketplace emerge, and they were starting to take notes. And take notes they did, while the public was busy consuming these heart-wrenching dramas. Another, much quieter audience was watching with intense, analytical interest. In the glass towers and sprawling corporate campuses of the American health insurance industry, The architects of the original broken system were observing this new phenomenon not with horror, but with something that looked suspiciously like delight from their perspective. A world where sick people begged strangers for money on the internet wasn't a dystopia, it was a dream come true. To understand their reaction, you have to understand the single, immutable law of the for-profit insurance industry: pay out as little as possible. Their entire business model is a high-stakes bet against your health. They win when they collect your premiums every month and lose every time they have to pay for your MRI. Every claim approved is a dent in the profit margin. Every claim denied is a victory for the shareholders. For decades, the only things reigning in their denials were the threat of lawsuits and the fear of a public relations nightmare that one viral story of a giant, evil corporation letting a cute kid die. But now, a miracle had occurred. The rise of medical crowdfunding created a beautiful, elegant, and completely unintentional solution to their PR problem. It was a pressure release valve for public outrage. GoFund didn't just become a safety net for patients. It became a get-out-of-jail-free card for the entire health insurance industry. A perverse and deeply toxic new incentive was born. Before, denying a borderline claim for an expensive, life-saving treatment was a calculated risk. Now, the calculation had a new variable. The adjuster, sitting in their cubicle, could ask a new set of questions. Is this family media savvy? Are they sympathetic? Do they have a built-in social network? In other words, could they run a successful GoFundMe campaign? If the answer was yes, the risk of denying the claim plummeted. The potential for a PR disaster was magically transformed into the potential for a heartwarming story of a community coming together. The insurance company could deny the claim, and the feel-good industrial complex would swoop in and clean up the mess, celebrating the heroic crowd for stepping up, while the original villain of the story quietly slipped out the back door. This is the scandal that happens in the shadows, in the actuarial tables and risk assessment spreadsheets. It's the birth of a profound moral hazard. Cause: insurance corporations, which are legally mandated to maximize shareholder profit. Observe that crowdfunding has become a viable, if unreliable, alternative funding source for patients. They deny. Effect: this creates an implicit safety net that is funded not by the insurer, but by the public. This lowers the reputational and financial risk for the insurer when they deny expensive, high-profile, or experimental treatments. Consequence: insurers become emboldened. The bar for denial gets lower. They begin to systematically, if unofficially, offload their most expensive and riskiest liabilities onto the goodwill of the general public. They have successfully outsourced their core function, paying for healthcare, while religiously continuing to collect the premiums for it. The pure, predatory genius of this is almost admirable in its cynicism. My inner narrator is giving it a slow, disgusted clap. The insurance industry had found a way to have its cake and eat it, too. They could continue to operate as a toll booth, collecting money from everyone. But when a truly expensive car came through, they could just shrug, point to the crowd, and say, maybe they can help you out. They were a casino that had figured out how to make the other gamblers cover the jackpots. It was the ultimate privatization of risk, a system where their profits were guaranteed, and their failures were subsidized by the GoFund donations of strangers. Imagine the internal monologue. Case file number 8675B. Patient, 12 years old, needs a $250,000 proton therapy treatment. It's not technically experimental anymore, but it's still expensive as hell. Pre-GoFundMera. We'd probably have to approve this after a big fight to avoid being on the evening news. But now, the family is active on Facebook. The kid is adorable. This has viral campaign written all over it. Recommendation: deny. Let the crowd handle it. This wasn't some grand conspiracy hatched in a smoky room. It was something much more insidious. It was the emergent property of a ruthless, profit-seeking system discovering a new loophole. It was the logical endpoint of a world where healthcare is a commodity, not a right. The existence of the crowdfunding solution made the problem of claim denials less visible, less politically toxic, and therefore easier to commit. And the most terrifying part, this dynamic didn't just impact the 46 million people who had no insurance. This creeping logic began to infect the plans of the safely insured. The insurance companies, emboldened by their new get-out-of-jail-free card, were about to get much more creative with how they could shift costs away from their balance sheets and onto the backs of their own paying customers. They had seen what the public was willing to pay for. Now they were going to see if they could make their own customers pay for their care twice: once through premiums, and a second time through a system that was about to make a mockery of the very concept of being insured. The insurance companies, high on their newfound immunity from public outrage, didn't just get more creative, they got bolder. They realized they didn't have to bother with the messy business of denying claims if they could. Just rewrite the rules of the game so their customers were never truly covered in the first place. And so, they unleashed their masterstroke, their Trojan horse of cost shifting, wrapped in the glossy packaging of consumer choice and empowerment. It was called the High Deductible Health Plan, or HDHP, and it was the weapon that would make a mockery of the very word insurance. The pitch was seductive, especially to cash-strapped employers and their workers. Hey, you want a lower monthly premium? Of course you do. Who doesn't want more money in their paycheck? All you have to do is accept this one tiny little change. We'll just add a deductible. A significant deductible, a deductible the size of a used car, or a down payment on a house, or the entire GDP of a small island nation. In exchange for saving $100 a month on your premium, your insurance would now only kick in after you had personally paid the first $5,000, $8,000, or even $15,000 of your medical bills for the year. It was the equivalent of a fire department that would only show up to your house after it had already burned down to the foundations. It was a bodyguard who would only step in after you'd already been mugged, beaten, and left for dead. It was a subscription service for a safety net that was stored on the moon. Technically, you had it, but you were never, ever going to be able to use it for anything short of a direct asteroid impact. This masterclass in corporate gaslighting gave birth to a vast and miserable new social class, the functionally uninsured. These were people who dutifully paid their premiums. They carried a shiny insurance card in their wallet. They could, if asked, tell you the name of their provider, but for all practical purposes, they were on their own. The wall of the deductible was so high, so unscalable for the average family, that they avoided the doctor for anything other than a mortal wound. They were paying for the privilege of not having health care. Here is the scandal. A quiet policy shift that was one of the greatest wealth transfers from the middle class to the corporate sector in modern history, caused employers desperate to cut their own rapidly rising health care costs, and insurers eager to reduce their payouts aggressively promoted HDHPs as the new standard of coverage. Effect, millions of American workers were transitioned, often with little choice, from traditional insurance plans into these high-deductible models. The financial risk for routine and even moderately serious health events was surgically transferred from the corporation directly to the employee. Consequence, this created a nation of the functionally uninsured. When faced with a necessary surgery, a broken bone, or even just a series of diagnostic tests, these insured individuals were hit with bills they couldn't possibly pay. The line between the insured and the uninsured blurred into meaninglessness, and so the GoFund queues began to swell with a new type of refugee, people with good, corporate, name brand insurance. My inner narrator is just fuming at the linguistic fraud. Calling these people insured is a crime against the English language. It's like calling a leaky raft a cruise ship. The branding was pure Orwellian genius. They called it consumer-driven healthcare. The only thing consumers were driven to do was drive straight to the GoFund website. They paired these plans with health savings accounts HSA letters, which were sold as a savvy investment vehicle. In reality, for most people, an HSA was just a glorified piggy bank, where you desperately tried to save a few $1,000s to cover 1/5 of the bill for your inevitable ACL surgery. Here's the snapshot that shows this wasn't a niche problem. By 2021, according to the Kaiser Family Foundation, nearly 52% of the American workforce was enrolled in a high-deductible plan. The average annual deductible for a single person had soared to over $1,600, and for a family, it was over $3,000, and that's just the average. Plenty were much, much higher. Imagine the scenario. You're a responsible adult. You have a decent job with benefits. The HDHP was the great equalizer of medical misery. It didn't matter if your insurance card said Blue Cross or Aetna. If your deductible was high enough, you were in the same leaky boat as everyone else. The social contract was now fully broken, not just for the poor and the marginalized, but for the mainstream, the middle class, the people who thought they had done everything right. The system was now designed to fail almost everyone. And for one particular, rapidly growing segment of the American workforce, the failure was about to become even more acute and unavoidable. And for this new, rapidly growing segment of the American workforce, the failure was not just acute. It was the entire business model. Enter the gig economy. The logical endpoint of the post-2008 meltdown, it was sold to a shell-shocked population as the future of work, a glittering promise of liberation from the 9-to-5 grind. Be your own boss. Set your own hours. Live the freelance dream. The marketing was intoxicating. a world of ultimate flexibility, powered by a slick app on your phone. You weren't an employee anymore, you were an entrepreneur, a partner, a micro CEO of your own hustle. The reality, of course, was a brutal trade-off, a devil's bargain written in the fine print of a user agreement nobody ever read. The entire, multi-trillion-dollar edifice of the gig economy was built on one single, legally dubious foundation, classifying workers not as employees, but as independent contractors. This wasn't just a semantic distinction, it was a chasm. By slapping the contractor label on their drivers, couriers, and freelance TaskRabbits, these disruptive tech giants could legally sidestep every single worker protection won over the last century. Minimum wage, gone. Overtime pay, a relic of the past. Paid sick leave, hilarious. And the crown, jewel of the old, broken system, employer-sponsored health insurance. Not a chance. The freelance dream rapidly became a nightmare the moment you got a toothache, let alone a real diagnosis. The promise of freedom was revealed to be the freedom to go bankrupt from a single medical event. You could have a perfect 5-star rating as an Uber driver, but that sterling reputation couldn't pay for your emergency appendectomy. You could be the fastest Instacart shopper in your city, but that didn't get you a discount on your kid's asthma inhaler. Your entire existence was a gamble, a bet that you would remain perfectly healthy while navigating a precarious, algorithm-driven job with no safety net. This is the central, audacious scandal of the new economy. It's a policy of deliberate misclassification for profit. Cause, multi-billion-dollar tech platforms like Uber, Lyft, and DoorDash architected their entire business model around the legal classification of their workforce as 1099 independent contractors. Effect, this allowed them to evade the immense costs associated with being an employer, primarily payroll taxes, workers' compensation, and of course, health insurance. They offloaded 100% of the risk and responsibility for healthcare onto the individual worker. Consequence, millions of gig workers were created with zero access to traditional benefits, casting them into the barren wilderness of the individual insurance market, which most could not afford. This created a massive, captive new demographic for whom medical crowdfunding was not a last resort, but the only resort. They were the system's perfect customers. My inner narrator just has to marvel at the sheer, unmitigated gall. These companies, celebrated on the covers of magazines as brilliant innovators, built their empires on a labor practice that would have made a 19th century railroad baron blush. They used the language of disruption and progress to disguise a business model that was fundamentally about stripping away rights from workers to subsidize cheap cab rides and fast food delivery for consumers. It wasn't innovation, it was a sophisticated, app-based system for the institutional evasion of social responsibility. Imagine the scene, and it plays out thousands of times a day. You're a food delivery courier, hustling to make rent. The app pings you with a stacked order to deliveries for slightly more money, but you have to be fast. You're weaving through traffic, the insulated bag on your back, when a car runs a red light. You wake up in an ambulance. Your leg is broken. Your bike is a pretzel. The first thing you discover is that there is no workers' comp. The accident happened while you were working, but you're not an employee. The second thing you discover is that you have no paid sick leave. Every day you can't work is a day you earn $0. The third, most terrifying discovery is that the $30,000 hospital bill is entirely your problem. The app on your phone, your supposed business partner, simply logs you out. Your only path forward is to take a picture of your cast, write a compelling story about the accident, and pray that strangers on the internet will subsidize the true cost of their cheap burrito delivery. The uninsured, the underinsured with their sky-high deductibles, and now the massive, growing army of gig workers, they all found themselves in the same place. They were refugees of a system that had been deliberately dismantled, a system that had decided that the health of its people was no longer a public good, but a personal problem to be solved through the terrifying lottery of digital charity. The demand for these platforms was exploding, and as the number of campaigns skyrocketed, the platform owners realized they were sitting on a gold mine. After all, every single one of these desperate transactions came with a small, almost invisible, but relentlessly accumulating service charge. The market for misery was booming. The uninsured, the functionally uninsured, and the gig-working uninsured were all flocking to the digital town square. Their heartbreaking stories serving as the fuel for a new, explosive industry, and the companies that own the town square, particularly GoFund, were getting fantastically, obscenely rich. How? Through the quiet, almost polite, but utterly relentless collection of a hidden tax on being sick. It was the world's most depressing service fee, a small percentage skim from the very top of every single life-saving donation. In the beginning, the model was brutally simple. For the privilege of using their platform to beg for your life, GoFund would take a 5% cut, a platform fee. On top of that, there was always the standard payment processing fee, the unavoidable slice taken by the credit card companies and payment processors like Stripe, which was usually around a 0.9% plus 30 cents per transaction. Do the math. For every $100 a kind stranger donated to your chemotherapy fund, only about $90 actually made it to you. The other $8 vanished into the digital ether, split between the credit card company and the platform. Think about that. Here is your snapshot of the skim. For every $100,000 raised to save a child's life, a monumental, miraculous goal achieved through the collective goodwill of thousands of people, nearly $8,000 of it simply evaporated. It was siphoned off to pay for GoFund server costs in Silicon Valley, for the salaries of their software engineers, for their marketing budget, and for the eventual glorious payday for their venture capital investors. They weren't just a platform, they were a toll collector on the only bridge out of town. And the toll was a slice of the money people gave you so you wouldn't die. My inner narrator is just slow clapping the sheer predatory elegance of it. It's like calling 911 and having the operator say, "Okay, we'll send a fire truck, but our service fee is 5% of the total value of the property we save." It is a business model that inserts itself as a mandatory middleman between a person in crisis and the charity of others, and then bills them both for the transaction. As the platform grew and the optics of taking a direct cut from cancer patients started to look, a little evil, GoFund executed a PR move of pure, unadulterated genius in 2017. For personal campaigns in the US, they announced they were dropping the 5% platform fee. It was an act of incredible corporate generosity. The headlines were glowing. GoFund was making its platform free for those in need, except it wasn't. This is the next level of the scandal. A masterclass in psychological manipulation and user interface dark patterns. Cause, facing increasing scrutiny over profiting directly from human tragedy, GoFund needed a more palatable way to generate revenue that would also serve as a brilliant public relations coup. Effect, they eliminated the mandatory 5% platform fee and replaced it with a voluntary tip system. At the checkout page, donors were now prompted to leave an optional tip for GoFund itself to help us help others. Consequence, this was a wolf in sheep's clothing. The tipping field was often pre-filled with a suggested amount, sometimes as high as 15%. Many donors, caught in the emotional act of giving, either didn't notice, didn't understand it was optional, or felt socially pressured to add a tip. This new model was likely just as if not more profitable than the old one, but it allowed GoFund to launder its image from a fee-based service to a donor-supported charity, all while remaining a fiercely for-profit tech company. The design of that tipping page is a case study in cynical UX. It's presented right at the moment you're feeling your most generous. You've just decided to give $50 to help a sick kid. A little pop-up asks if you'd like to add a $7.50 tip to keep GoFund running. What are you going to do? Click the tiny link to manually change the tip to $0 and feel like a cheapskate. Most people just went with it. It was a brilliant grift, preying on the best of human nature to pad their corporate bottom line. So, while the crowd was funding life-saving treatments, they were also unwittingly funding a rapidly growing, multi-billion-dollar tech unicorn. The money flowing through this ecosystem was staggering. It was an unregulated, wild west of finance, fueled by goodwill and desperation, and anytime a system like that emerges, with vast sums of money being moved around based on little more than a sad story and a compelling photo, it inevitably attracts a different kind of user. Not the desperate, not the generous, but the predatory. The scammers were coming. The smell of easy money attracts sharks, and the unregulated, billion-dollar ocean of GoFund was beginning to look like a feeding frenzy. The system was built on a single, fragile commodity, trust. It assumed the stories were true, the pain was real, and the need was honest. This noble, naive assumption was about to get run over by the freight train of human greed. The grifters were here, and they realized something profound. Faking a terminal illness online was a hell of a lot easier, and potentially more lucrative, than getting a real job. In a marketplace that runs on unverified stories, fraud isn't a bug, it's an inevitable feature. The same tools that a desperate family used to save their child were a perfect toolkit for a sociopath looking to fund a new car. The anatomy of the scam was simple, cynical, and devastatingly effective. The most common grift was the full fabrication. A con artist would invent a gut-wrenching medical tragedy out of thin air. They'd steal a sad story they saw on a TV medical drama, grab some stock photos of a sick person from the internet, and write a campaign that would make a stone weep. They'd become master performers of a pain they never felt. Then there were the exaggerators, the masters of the subtle lie. They'd take a real, but manageable, medical condition, a minor surgery, a treatable illness, and inflate it into a 5-alarm catastrophe. A routine procedure became a desperate fight for life. A common prescription became an impossibly expensive experimental drug. They'd use the grain of truth to sell a mountain of lies, expertly tugging at heartstrings for a payday that far exceeded their actual need. And perhaps most cruelly, there was the third-party hijack. A real tragedy would strike, a family's house would burn down, a child would get a terrible diagnosis, and the story would make the local news. A scammer miles away would see the story, quickly set up a GoFundMe page for that family, complete with their pictures and story details, but with one crucial difference. The bank account linked to the Donate Now button was their own. They would siphon off the goodwill of a community before the actual victims even knew what was happening. This is the scandal of willful ignorance on the part of the platforms. Their business model was predicated on explosive growth and minimizing friction, making people go through a rigorous hospital document-level verification process before launching a campaign would slow things down. It would kill the viral in the moment fundraising for fires and accidents. So, for years, their policy was essentially trust by default. Cause, the platforms prioritized a frictionless user experience and rapid campaign creation over robust, upfront fraud verification to encourage massive user growth. Effect, this created an ideal environment for scammers who could launch sophisticated, fraudulent campaigns with relative ease and start collecting money before any red flags were raised. The platforms relied heavily on users to police the system, outsourcing their security to the crowd. Consequence, a series of high-profile, sensational scams were uncovered, often after raising tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars. The media, which loved the miracle stories, loved the mastermind scam stories even more. This coverage began to systematically erode public trust in the entire concept of online crowdfunding. It poisoned the well for everyone. My inner narrator is just shaking his head. The platforms would eventually roll out guarantees and trust and safety teams, but it was a reactive, not proactive stance. They became experts at the cleanup, issuing refunds and apologetic press releases after a scam had already gone viral, embarrassed them publicly, and hurt countless people. It was the digital equivalent of hiring a security guard to stand at the stable door after the horse has already been stolen, butchered, and sold for parts. We all saw the headlines. There was the infamous case of the couple who faked a story about their homeless veteran benefactor to raise over $400,000. There was the time a woman faked pancreatic cancer, shaved her head, and conned her entire town before someone realized her GoFundMe photo was taken from another sick person's blog. These weren't just isolated incidents, they were a genre. Online communities on Reddit and Facebook became amateur detective agencies dedicated to debunking suspicious campaigns, reverse image searching photos, and pointing out the logical flaws in a scammer's narrative. The ultimate, tragic victim of these scams wasn't just the donors who lost their money. It was every single person with a legitimate, desperate need. The well was poisoned. Every potential donor now had a seed of doubt planted in their mind. Is this story real? Is this person truly sick? Am I being played? This rising tide of skepticism, a direct result of the platform's growth at all costs mentality, created a new, invisible barrier for the truly desperate. It wasn't just the algorithm they had to please anymore. Now they had to pass the sniff test of a wary and increasingly cynical public. And yet, the number of real campaigns continued to explode, turning the digital town square from a place of hope into something else entirely, a brutal, oversaturated, and deeply competitive arena. With the well of public trust now tainted by scammers, the thousands of people with real, legitimate stories found themselves in an even more horrifying predicament. It wasn't enough to be honest. You now had to be compelling. You had to be marketable. The digital town square was no longer a place of quiet hope. It had become a brutal, oversaturated arena. The sheer volume of need had created a zero-sum game of survival. Welcome to the Hunger Games of healthcare, where the prize for winning wasn't fame or fortune, but another few months of life. May the odds be ever in your favor. The fundamental problem was one of supply and demand. The supply of tragic stories was, tragically, infinite. The demand, the pool of donation dollars and finite public attention was not, at any given moment. The crowdfunding platforms were host to hundreds of thousands of active medical campaigns, all screaming into the same digital void, all hoping to be heard. This wasn't a community anymore, it was a marketplace of suffering. A grim auction where the sick were forced to put their pain on the block and sell it to the highest bidder. To win in this arena, you had to be the best. And best in this context meant the most tragic, the most compelling, the most heart-wrenching. A quiet story of dignity in the face of a common illness stood no chance. This was the Misery Olympics, and you were competing for the gold medal in pathos. A broken arm couldn't compete with cancer. A single organ transplant was less compelling than a multi-organ transplant. The stories had to become more graphic, the pleas more desperate, the stakes constantly escalated. Just to cut through the noise, your personal identity became a marketing asset. Certain demographics were simply more fundable. A sick child was the gold standard, virtually guaranteed to get more attention than a sick middle-aged man, a veteran, a teacher. A single mother. These identities carried narrative weight and were shamelessly leveraged in campaign titles. You weren't just John Smith, you were hero firefighter, dad needs your help. It was a brutal calculus of charisma and public appeal. This is the central, horrifying scandal of the competitive phase. The system had evolved into a form of digital social Darwinism. Cause, the explosive growth in the number of medical campaigns, created a massively oversaturated marketplace, forcing patients to compete against each other for a finite amount of attention and donations, effect, to stand out. Campaigns had to become more extreme in their emotional and graphic appeals. A patient's success became dependent on their ability to market their tragedy more effectively than the thousands of other tragedies available for public consumption. Consequence, this created a grotesque Hunger Games dynamic that rewarded the most sensational stories, not necessarily the most urgent needs. It punished those with quiet, common, or less photogenic illnesses. It turned survival into a brutal competition based on storytelling ability, marketing savvy, and demographic luck, completely divorced from the principles of medical ethics or human decency. The narrator in my head is just picturing the Capitol from the Hunger Games, with the wealthy scrolling through the tributes, deciding which sad story is worth sponsoring this week. We, the donors, became the sponsors. We were the ones making the impossible choices. Here's the snapshot that makes it real. Search GoFund right now for the word cancer. You will find over 150,000 active campaigns. You have $50 to donate. How do you choose? Do you pick the person with the cutest kid? The one with the best written story? The one whose photo is the most heartbreaking? This is the paralyzing, morally bankrupt calculus the system forces on everyone. This constant bombardment of tragedy had a predictable effect: donor fatigue. The endless parade of suffering, the constant demand for our attention and our cash, began to numb the public. Our capacity for empathy, while vast, is not infinite. As we became desensitized, the campaigns had to shout even louder, become even more extreme. To get a reaction, a vicious cycle was born, pushing the performance of pain to its absolute limits. It was a system that rewarded the novel and punished the mundane. An ultra-rare, never-before-heard-of disease was fascinating. It was new, it was interesting content, good old-fashioned, tragically common heart disease. That was yesterday's news. The system incentivized the bizarre, turning real human illnesses into viral curiosities. And for the tiny, lucky fraction who managed to win this horrific lottery, the ones whose stories were sad enough, whose kids were cute enough, whose marketing was savvy enough to hit their goal, the ordeal wasn't over. They had survived the arena. They had won the sponsorship of the crowd. But as they collected their winnings, they were about to discover that a new, an entirely unexpected adversary was waiting for them just outside the gates. Holding a clipboard and a calculator, Uncle Sam wanted his cut, or at least, he was very confused. So you won. You survived the Misery Olympics. Your story was sadder. Your pictures were sharper. Your social media game was stronger. The progress bar on your GoFund turned a triumphant green. The money a life-altering, life-saving sum was transferred to your bank account. You wept with relief. You hugged your family. You could finally schedule the surgery, buy the medicine, pay the bill. For one brief, shining moment, you were safe, and then the party came to a screeching halt. Because a new guest had just arrived, uninvited, wearing a cheap suit and a grim expression. It was Uncle Sam, and he was very confused about this whole arrangement. The American tax code is a multi-thousand-page Lovecraftian horror story, written in a language that is technically English, but communicates only despair. It has rules for depreciating a tractor, for deducting business lunches, for literally everything under the sun except, for the longest time, for the strange new reality of 100,000 strangers giving you money on the internet so you wouldn't die. The IRS, an institution that moves with the speed and agility of a tectonic plate, was utterly unprepared for the GoFundMe explosion. This lack of clarity created a second, soul-crushing nightmare for every successful campaign manager. The entire problem boiled down to one simple, terrifying question: was the money a gift or was it income? The answer could mean the difference between life and financial ruin. If the money was a collection of gifts, everything was mostly fine. In the US tax system, gifts are not taxable income for the person who receives them. It's the giver who is theoretically on the hook for a gift tax. But what if the IRS decided it was income? What if they argued that you had provided a service, the service of a compelling story, of regular updates, of being an inspiration in exchange for payment? In that case, the entire sum would be subject to income tax, that life-saving $100 zero you just raised. Suddenly you owed $50,000 of it to the federal government. Your miracle fund was now just another paycheck, and you were about to be pushed into a higher tax bracket by your own cancer diagnosis. This is the scandal of bureaucratic paralysis. A new financial reality for millions of vulnerable people was met with years of deafening silence and ambiguity from the one agency that could provide clarity. Cause: the rapid emergence of a massive, novel peer-to-peer fundraising system completely outpaced the ability of the ancient, slow-moving U.S. tax code and the IRS to create clear, specific rules for it. Effect: this plunged millions of sick people and their families into a state of extreme legal and financial uncertainty. Tax advisors gave conflicting advice. Fear, uncertainty, and doubt became the final stage of every successful medical fundraiser. Consequence: this ambiguity added a profound new layer of psychological and administrative torture to the process. People were forced to either pray they wouldn't be audited or to proactively set aside a huge chunk of their life-saving funds for a potential tax bill that might never come. They had to crowdfund for their health care, and then crowdfund for the taxes on their health care crowdfund. My inner narrator is just banging his head on the desk. You fight a terminal illness. You win the Hunger Games. And your reward is to lie awake at night, sweating, because you don't know if your GoFundMe is going to trigger an audit that will bankrupt you all over again. It's a Russian doll of systemic failure. The real moment of panic often came in January. That's when you get the form, a 1099K from the payment processor. It's a simple, terrifying piece of paper sent to both you and the IRS, dutifully reporting that your social security number was associated with $150 zero in gross payment card and third-party network transactions. It doesn't say charitable gifts from kind strangers. It says transactions. Now, imagine trying to explain the nuance of that to an automated IRS computer system that has flagged you for failing to report a massive amount of income. Good luck. This fear forced people to get creative. They'd have a healthy relative set up the campaign in their name. They'd consult with expensive accountants, spending thousands of their precious medical funds just to navigate the bureaucratic maze. It was a cruel, unnecessary epilogue to an already tragic story. While these patients were untangling this new kind of red tape, another, much older institution was observing the success of crowdfunding with great interest. They weren't confused at all. They saw a golden opportunity to solve one of their oldest problems. The hospitals were coming to the party. While patients were battling the IRS, the hospitals were having a revelation. For decades, they'd been grappling with a chronic, multi-billion-dollar headache: uncompensated care. This was the polite industry term for patients who simply couldn't pay their astronomical bills. This bad debt was a plague on their balance sheets, a problem they usually solved by either hounding people with ruthless collection agencies or, more commonly, just jacking up the prices for everyone else who could pay. But now, they saw a new path, a miracle solution being served up on a silver, algorithm-driven platter. They saw GoFundMe, and they realized they no longer had to collect the debt themselves. They could just get the public to do it for them. The shift was subtle at first, a grassroots change happening in the beige, linoleum-floored offices of hospital financial counselors across the country. A patient, uninsured or saddled with a deductible the size of a condo, would sit across from a counselor, pale with terror after seeing the estimated cost of their upcoming surgery. In the old days, the conversation would have been about ruinous payment plans or asset-liquidating bankruptcy. But now, the counselor, with a tone of practiced, gentle helpfulness, would lean in and ask a new question: have you considered crowdfunding? This was the birth of the GoFundMe prescription. It started as an informal suggestion and quickly evolved into a standard operating procedure. Hospitals began systematically outsourcing their debt collection to the patient's own friends and family. It was a strategy of breathtaking, predatory genius. It allowed the hospital to maintain its absurd pricing structure while simultaneously positioning itself as a helpful partner in the patient's fundraising journey. This is the scandal of institutionalized begging. The very entities creating the crushing debt were now actively coaching their victims on how to publicly solicit donations to pay it off. Cause hospitals, seeking to reduce their losses from uncompensated care, identified the booming medical crowdfunding scene as a powerful new tool for revenue recovery. Effect, they began to formally and informally integrate crowdfunding into their financial counseling and billing processes. Staff were trained to helpfully suggest that patients who couldn't pay should start a GoFundMe campaign. Consequence, this practice fully institutionalized digital panhandling as a feature, not a bug, of the American healthcare system. It created a profound conflict of interest, with hospitals acting as both the source of the financial crisis, the bill, and the advisor on the solution, the begging. They were the arsonists handing you a GoFund brochure and wishing you the best of luck. With the Bucket Brigade, my inner narrator is just in awe of the sheer, unmitigated audacity. Imagine going to a restaurant, getting a bill for a $1,000 hamburger, and when you can't pay, the manager smiles sympathetically and says, "No problem. We've set up a table for you by the door with a little cup. Just tell your sad story to everyone who comes in." We find it's a very effective payment strategy. That is precisely what the American hospital system began to do. The new discharge instructions might as well have been, take 2 of these pills every 6 hours. Get plenty of rest, and make sure your GoFundMe campaign title is emotionally compelling. We find that photos of sick children perform 30% better in terms of donor conversion. Some hospitals even formalize the process, placing pamphlets for crowdfunding sites in their waiting rooms or adding links to them on their official patient resource websites. A few particularly innovative health systems even partnered with third-party companies, whose entire business was to manage the crowdfunding process for patients, taking yet another cut of the money for their expert services. Picture the scene. You're in a small, windowless office. The air smells of antiseptic and quiet despair. This widespread adoption of crowdfunding as hospital policy was the final seal of approval, the ultimate normalization of a system that should have been a national scandal, and the most infuriating part. All of this was happening. This whole horrifying ecosystem was metastasizing, just as a landmark piece of legislation was being rolled out that was supposed to fix American healthcare once and for all. The Affordable Care Act had arrived, and it was about to walk straight into this buzzsaw, into this raging tire fire of high deductibles, gig economy misery, and hospital-prescribed begging. Strode a policy so vast, so ambitious, and so immediately controversial it was destined to define a decade of American politics. It was the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, known to the world, for better or worse, as Obamacare. On paper, it was the cavalry. It was the legislative superhero swooping in to slay the dragon of the for-profit healthcare industry. It was supposed to be the end of the story we're telling. It was supposed to make medical crowdfunding obsolete. The promises were monumental. The law aimed to patch the 1,000 holes in the sinking ship of American healthcare. For the uninsured, it created subsidized online marketplaces and a massive expansion of Medicaid, the government program for the poor, for those who already had insurance. It offered a shield. Insurance companies could no longer deny you coverage for a pre-existing condition. They couldn't kick you off your plan when you got sick. They had to cover a list of essential health benefits, from maternity care to mental health services. It was a genuine, good-faith attempt to declare that in the richest country on earth, healthcare should be a right, or at least something vaguely resembling one. The initial hope was palpable. Surely, if 20 million more people got insurance cards, the GoFund machine would grind to a halt. Surely, if insurers had to play by a new set of rules, the need for digital panhandling would wither and die. But the ACA wasn't a revolution. It was a compromise, a patch job of epic proportions. It tried to fix the sinking ship not by rebuilding it in a dry dock, but by frantically applying duct tape and bailing water while the ship was still in the middle of a hurricane. And a whole lot of people immediately started trying to rip the duct tape off. This is the great, paradoxical scandal of the ACA era. The law was simultaneously a historic achievement and a tragic disappointment, crippled from birth by political sabotage and the unshakable foundation of the for-profit system it was built upon. Cause the Affordable Care Act is implemented, a sweeping market-based reform designed to reduce the number of uninsured Americans and regulate the insurance industry. Effect, the law succeeds in covering millions and enacting vital consumer protections. However, a Supreme Court ruling makes the Medicaid expansion optional, which about a dozen states refuse. leaving millions of their poorest citizens in a coverage gap. Simultaneously, to keep premiums affordable on the new marketplaces, many of the available plans are high-deductible bronze and silver tiers. Consequence, the fundamental problem of underinsurance persists and in some ways is enshrined in the new system. Millions of newly covered Americans discover their insurance is all but useless until they've spent thousands of dollars out of pocket. The need for GoFund doesn't vanish, it just shifts. The platform becomes the primary tool for covering the deductibles and co-pays of the ACA insured. The band-aid was on, but the wound beneath was still festering. My inner narrator is just weeping at the tragic irony. The ACA was like trying to build a public park in the middle of a war zone. It was a noble idea, relentlessly shelved from day one by its political opponents. They filed dozens of lawsuits to dismantle it. They repealed the individual mandate, the financial engine designed to keep the marketplaces stable. They spent years scaring the public with lies about death panels. They were not trying to improve the ship. They were actively drilling new holes in the hull and then pointing at the rising water as proof that the ship was badly designed. The result was a confusing, frustrating experience for millions. Imagine you're a freelance graphic designer who never had insurance before. The ACA is a miracle. You go to the marketplace, and you can finally afford a plan. It's a bronze plan, but it's real insurance. You feel safe. Then you fall and need a simple outpatient surgery. Here's your snapshot of the paradoxical reality, a decade after the ACA became law. A 2022 report showed that despite the uninsured rate hitting an all-time low, nearly 100 million Americans, almost 41% of all adults, were still saddled with healthcare debt. The law had changed the rules, but it hadn't changed the outcome. The GoFund industrial complex, which should have been mortally wounded by the ACA, barely flinched. It just adapted. It had a whole new market to service, the ACA underinsured. The platform's growth didn't even slow down. The stories just changed slightly. The campaign titles were no longer "I have no insurance." They were "My insurance won't cover this," or "Help me. Meet my deductible." The crisis continued, just with a different set of paperwork, and as this chronic, unending need became a permanent feature of the social media landscape, a new kind of player saw it not as a problem to be solved, but as a resource to be mined. The influencers were about to get involved. The GoFund ecosystem was now a permanent, chaotic feature of the digital landscape, a raging river of desperation and hope that flowed directly through the heart of social media. And when you have a river that powerful, it's only a matter of time before people show up with buckets, looking for a way to harness its power for their own purposes. Enter the influencers, the new high priests of the attention economy, who looked at this river of tragedy and saw a spectacular opportunity for brand engagement. The influencer economy runs on a simple, brutal principle: attention is currency. Your personal brand, your carefully curated online persona, is your business. And the fuel for that business is engagement: the likes, the comments, the shares, the saves. An influencer is in a constant 24/7's war against algorithmic indifference, and they need a reliable supply of emotionally potent content to win. And what, in the entire digital universe, is more emotionally potent than a life or death struggle? And so, the compassion play was born. Influencers. From the micro YouTuber with 10,000 subscribers to the mega celebrity with 100 million, discovered that sharing a medical crowdfunding campaign was a masterstroke of content strategy. First, it was guaranteed engagement. A post about a sick child will always get more likes and heartfelt comments than a post about a new brand of sparkling water. It was a foolproof way to juice their metrics and signal to the algorithm that their content was valuable and resonant. Second, it was a spectacular tool for brand building. In a world of shallow consumerism, an influencer could instantly add a layer of depth and compassion to their persona by using their platform for good. It was the ultimate performance of altruism. For the cost of a single retweet, a beauty guru could transform their image from someone who just sells overpriced lipstick into a caring, socially conscious philanthropist. It was virtue signaling as a service, and the results were phenomenal. This is the scandal of commodified compassion. The act of charity was absorbed into the machinery of digital marketing. Cause social media influencers, driven by the need for high engagement content to grow their personal brands, realize that sharing tragic medical GoFund stories is a highly effective tactic. Effect: the influencer signal boost becomes the new holy grail for desperate families. Getting a prominent influencer to share their campaign is now the single most effective way to go viral and reach their fundraising goal, creating a new, arbitrary gatekeeper to survival. Consequence: this establishes an even more absurd and inequitable lottery system. A patient's life could now depend not on their medical need, but on their ability to craft a plea that catches the eye of a famous TikTok star. It turns life or death situations into content, and it blurs the line between authentic charity and cynical brand management, until the two are indistinguishable. The narrator in my head is just floored by the dystopian perfection of this system. The new American dream wasn't to get a stable job with a good pension. It was to have your GoFund for your kid's rare disease get a single, solitary share from Taylor Swift or Akata Shane. That one click, that one moment of attention from a digital deity, could be the difference between life and death. Of course, not every influencer was a cynical monster. Many were genuinely moved and honestly trying to help, but the system itself, the very structure of the attention economy, incentivized the performance. The road to hell might be paved with good intentions, but the road to viral success is paved with other people's tragedies. The influencer gets a flood of positive engagement. Their followers feel like part of a heroic community, and the patient, if they're lucky, gets their money. It seems like a win-win-win. But the moral cost is the normalization of this insane reality that a sick person's best hope for survival lies in the content strategy of a professional selfie taker. For the patients and their families, this created a new, exhausting, and utterly humiliating job. On top of managing the medical crisis, on top of performing their pain for the algorithm, they now had to become publicists. Their days were spent sending hundreds of desperate, pleading messages into the digital void. Dear famous gamer, my son loves your videos. He also has stage 4 neuroblastoma. Could you please share his GoFund? Dear makeup vlogger, I've followed you for years. My sister needs a lung transplant. A share would mean the world to us. It was a constant, grinding, and mostly fruitless effort to catch the attention of the digital gods. Imagine the sheer psychological weight of it all. You are navigating the most terrifying experience of your life. Your body is failing. You're scared. You're exhausted. And on top of that, you are forced to be a full-time marketer, a content creator, a social media strategist, a publicist, and a reality TV star. You are managing multiple, complex, and unforgiving systems at once. The medical system, the insurance system, the GoFund algorithm, and the influencer attention economy. It's a burden that would crush even the healthiest person. And for the critically ill, it was a recipe for a complete and total collapse. This is the hidden cost, the invisible injury that doesn't show up on any medical bill. It's the complete and total collapse of the human spirit under the weight of this impossible, multi-front war. It's the burnout of begging to live. Doctors and nurses can treat the disease in your body, but there is no prescription for the soul-crushing exhaustion that comes from managing a full-time marketing campaign for your own existence, while your body is actively trying to quit. This wasn't just the normal fatigue of being sick. This was a new, technologically induced form of exhaustion, a uniquely modern affliction. It was a burnout born from the relentless, 24/7 grind of the campaign. The internet never sleeps, which means your fight for survival can never take a day off. You wake up, and the first thing you do isn't taking your temperature. It's checking the GoFund dashboard. How much came in overnight? Did anyone new share the post? You spend your morning not resting, but crafting the perfect, emotionally calibrated update, hopeful but desperate, strong but vulnerable. You spend your afternoon in a chemo chair, your body screaming for peace, while your phone buzzes with an endless stream of comments from well-meaning strangers that you feel a crushing obligation to personally thank. The emotional whiplash was a form of torture. One day, a huge, anonymous donation of $1,000 would come in, and you'd be flooded with euphoric, dizzying hope. You were going to make it. The next 3 days would bring nothing but silence. A digital void that echoed with your deepest fears. The progress bar wouldn't move. The donations would dry up, and you'd be plunged back into a spiral of despair, convinced you'd been forgotten, that your story wasn't sad enough, that you were going to fail. Living on this knife's edge of hope and terror, day after day, is enough to break anyone. This is the unspoken, insidious scandal of the platform's design. The very mechanics that make the platforms successful are toxic to the mental health of their most vulnerable users. Cause, the algorithms of social media and the design of crowdfunding sites reward constant activity. A campaign's visibility is directly tied to the patient's ability to continuously produce new content, engage with donors, and maintain momentum. Effect, this forces the patient and their family into a relentless cycle of work. The immense pressure of being a marketer, fundraiser, content creator, and grateful public figure is added to the already overwhelming burden of being a patient or a caregiver. Consequence, this leads to a profound state of campaign burnout. Sufferers experience extreme anxiety, depression, physical exhaustion, and a deep sense of shame and alienation. The very process that is supposed to be a lifeline becomes a source of immense psychological harm. The cure for the financial crisis actively poisons the patient's well-being. The narrator in my head just wants to scream, "This is cruelty. It is the ultimate act of a society, washing its hands of its own people. We have taken a collective, societal responsibility caring for the sick and transformed it into a brutal, individual, DIY project. We hand a drowning person a bucket and a roll of duct tape and tell them to build their own boat. Then we stand on the shore and critique their craftsmanship while they sink." The burnout isn't a side effect of the system, it is the system's desired outcome. It transfers all the labor, all the stress, and all the moral weight of the crisis onto the shoulders of the person who is least able to bear it. One person, writing about their experience, put it this way: "I spent more time last week responding to donor comments on Facebook than I did talking to my own children. I am not sure if I am a patient anymore or just a social media manager for my own disease." That is the reality. The performance of gratitude becomes a crushing obligation. You have to thank every single person, no matter how small the donation. You have to reply to every comment. You have to project an image of unwavering hope and inspiring strength because donors want to back a winner. You are not allowed to be tired. You are not allowed to be angry. You are not allowed to be scared. Your authentic human emotions are a liability to your brand. And this burden rarely fell on the patient alone. It consumed entire families. Spouses became campaign managers. Parents became copywriters. Siblings became social media strategists. The family, which should have been a sanctuary from the storm, was transformed into a desperate, sleep-deprived marketing agency, working around the clock to save the life of the person they loved. The disease was attacking one member of the family, but the campaign was attacking them all. This relentless, all-consuming effort was predicated on one single, desperate hope that it would all be worth it in the end. That the burnout and the humiliation and the sleepless nights would lead to a fully funded campaign and a second chance at life. But what happens when it doesn't? What happens when you pour every last ounce of your energy into the machine and it still isn't enough? What happens when the algorithm just says no? And the brutal, unspoken truth is that for the overwhelming majority, the algorithm almost always says no. The burnout, the humiliation, the 24/7's grind, it all leads not to a tearful, triumphant victory, but to a quiet, soul-crushing fizzle. This is the great, untelevised scandal of the entire medical crowdfunding ecosystem, the vast, silent, unreported ocean of its failures. It is a system built on a foundation of survivorship bias, a lottery that advertises its winners on giant billboards, while quietly burying its millions of losing tickets in an unmarked grave. The feel-good industrial complex, with its endless parade of miracle stories, has sold the world a lie. It has presented viral hope as a safety net when in reality, it is a tightrope stretched over the Grand Canyon with no net at all. The handful of people who make it across are celebrated on the evening news. The thousands who fall are never mentioned again. Their stories do not get clicks. Their failures are not inspiring. They are simply gone. The statistics, when you can find them, are a splash of ice-cold water to the face. Here's your snapshot of the grim reality, courtesy of a 2021 study from the University of Washington that finally pulled back the curtain. A staggering 90% of medical crowdfunding campaigns fail to reach their stated goal. 90%. And even that number hides a darker truth. This is the central, fraudulent premise of the entire industry. It is a lie of omission, perpetrated by both the platforms and the media that covers them. Cause, the platforms and the media create a powerful, self-serving narrative of hope by exclusively showcasing the tiny fraction of campaigns that are wildly successful. Effect, this cultivates a dangerously misleading public perception that GoFundMe is a viable and reliable solution to a medical crisis. It encourages millions of desperate people to pour their last reserves of energy and hope into a system that is statistically engineered to fail them. Consequence, the silent majority of campaigns fizzle out, leaving the patients not only with their original, crushing medical debt, but now also with the added trauma of a public failure. They are left physically and emotionally depleted from the burnout of a failed campaign, often feeling a profound and misplaced sense of personal shame for not having been worthy of rescue. My inner narrator is just enraged by the cruelty of it. Selling a lottery ticket as a health plan is one of the most evil things a society can do. For every heartwarming story of a community rallying to raise $500,000 for a child's surgery, there are, statistically, thousands of other stories that end in silence. A campaign for a diabetic who can afford insulin that raises $75. A campaign for an elderly man's cancer treatment that stalls out at 3% of its goal. A campaign for a single mother's heart medication that gets a handful of pity donations from her cousins. And then nothing. Imagine the life cycle of one of these failed campaigns. The first 48 hours are a rush of adrenaline. Your closest friends and family rush in, and you quickly raise $1,000, maybe $2,000. You feel a surge of hope. This might actually work. You share it frantically on Facebook. You write heartfelt updates. You pour your soul into the performance. And then nothing. The momentum stops dead. The donations trickle to a halt. The progress bar freezes. Days, then weeks, go by. You post another update, a more desperate plea, a more heartbreaking photo. You get a few sad face emojis and maybe one $20 donation. The silence is what breaks you. It's the slow, agonizing realization that the algorithm has passed you over. The influencer is not going to retweet you. The local news is not going to call. The cavalry is not coming. There is no miracle for you. The final act is the quietest, most humiliating one of all. You have to decide when to shut the campaign down, to formally admit defeat, to thank the 37 people who did donate, while knowing their kindness was just a drop in an ocean of debt. You are left not just sick and broke, but with the profound, crushing feeling that you have failed a public test of your own worthiness. This is the reality for the millions who are chewed up and spit out by the GoFundMe machine every year. Their stories aren't told because their stories reveal the truth that this is the safety net. It's a spectacle, a game, and most people who play lose. And it leaves you wondering, if a system this barbaric and dysfunctional is what the richest country in the world came up with, what on earth does everyone else do? The question hangs in the air, thick with the smoke of 1,000 burned-out dreams. If the American system is this uniquely barbaric, what on earth does the rest of the civilized world do? The answer, it turns out, is shockingly simple, profoundly effective, and to the American ear, apparently terrifying. They just take care of each other through a revolutionary and complex system known as paying taxes and having a government. Let's take a quick, condescending glance across the ocean, shall we? Welcome to the magical, almost mythical land of literally every other developed nation on the planet. In this strange world, the idea of tying your physical health to your job is seen as a historical curiosity. Like powdered wigs or horse-drawn carriages, the concept of a deductible that could bankrupt you is a mathematical absurdity. Here, they operate on a wild premise that a person's ability to live shouldn't be contingent on their wealth, their employment status, or their skill at writing a viral Facebook post. Try, for a moment, to explain the American system to someone from France or Japan or the United Kingdom. Their face will go through a series of fascinating contortions, starting with confusion, moving to disbelief, and landing on a sort of horrified pity. So, wait, the confused Canadian will say, pausing with a forkful of poutine halfway to their mouth. You get sick, you go to the doctor, and then a bill arrives. A bill for how much? Oh, dear. And your insurance, it doesn't pay it. So you must go on the internet and tell everyone your sad story, and they give you money? Is this for a television show? You explain that no, it's not a reality TV show. It's just Tuesday. They will look at you the way you would look at a man trying to put out a house fire with a squirt gun. They will not see stories of heartwarming charity. They will see a horrifying symptom of a failed state. They will see a dystopia. This is the ultimate scandal of American exceptionalism, the one that makes all the others possible. It is the stubborn, ideological refusal to do what works everywhere else. Cause decades ago, nearly every other industrialized nation made a political and moral decision to treat healthcare as a public good, like roads or schools, funding it collectively through taxes and making it accessible to all. In fact, these countries created a wide variety of universal health care systems. While none are perfect and all have their own challenges like wait times or budget fights, they have completely eliminated the fundamental terror of medical bankruptcy. Their citizens are healthier, live longer, and pay less per capita for their care. Consequence, the entire industry of medical crowdfunding, the entire horrifying spectacle we've just described, simply does not exist in these places. It is a uniquely American pathology. It is a billion-dollar industry that exists for no other reason than our refusal to solve the underlying problem. My inner narrator is just basking in the sheer, glorious simplicity of it all. The political discourse in America has been poisoned for decades by scaremongering about socialized medicine. We are told that the Canadian system is a death sentence of endless waiting lists, that the British NHS is a crumbling relic. Meanwhile, we are living in a real-life Hunger Games. And we're supposed to believe that our system is the pinnacle of freedom and choice. The freedom to choose which form of bankruptcy you'd prefer. The choice of which social media platform you want to beg on. Here is the only snapshot you will ever need to understand the difference. The number one reason for a GoFundMe campaign in the United States, by a massive margin, is medical bills. You know what one of the top reasons for GoFundMe is in Canada? Helping a local youth hockey team by New Jersey's. That's it. That's the whole story. They are crowdfunding for pucks. We are crowdfunding for pancreases. This isn't a mystery. It's a choice. It's a political choice, fueled by decades of lobbying from the insurance and pharmaceutical industries that reap billions from our broken system. It's an ideological choice, fueled by a deep-seated, almost religious belief in market-based solutions for problems that the market is uniquely terrible at solving. We are the only country that looks at this profound market failure, this grotesque, inefficient, and cruel spectacle, and concludes that the only problem is that we don't have enough market. We don't have enough apps. We don't have enough disruption. And that ideological blindness, that refusal to learn from the rest of the world, created the perfect opening for the final most modern player in this tragedy to take the stage and rebrand the whole disaster as a triumph of innovation. This ideological blindness, this stubborn insistence that a market problem just needs a better market, created the perfect environment for the final horseman of the modern apocalypse to ride in. The tech bro. From the kombucha-fueled open-plan offices of Silicon Valley, a new class of entrepreneur looked out at the smoldering ruins of the American healthcare system. And they did not see a human tragedy. They saw a market opportunity. They saw an inefficiency to be exploited. They saw a chance to get very, very rich by disrupting the act of human survival itself. The Silicon Valley mindset is a peculiar and powerful thing. It is a fundamentalist belief that there is no problem on earth, not poverty, not loneliness, not systemic injustice, that cannot be solved with a slick user interface, a clever algorithm, and a few $1 billion in venture capital funding. To them, a societal failure is just a total addressable market waiting for a hockey stick growth curve. And the American healthcare crisis was the biggest, saddest, and most profitable market of them all, so they began the great rebranding. The grotesque spectacle of the sick begging for their lives was repackaged in the optimistic, jargon-filled language of a tech startup. It wasn't digital panhandling anymore. It was peer-to-peer healthcare financing. It wasn't desperate people pleading for help. It was democratizing access to capital for medical needs. GoFundMe and its legion of imitators weren't profiting from misery. They were creating a platform for frictionless, community-based giving. They weren't a symptom of a crisis. They were the solution. This is the scandal of the great gaslighting. The moment the failure was laundered into a feature, it was a masterpiece of narrative warfare. Cause, the tech industry, armed with its ideology of market disruption and vast pools of venture capital, identified the gaping holes in the American healthcare safety net as a massive business opportunity. Effect, entrepreneurs and investors built and funded a host of for-profit crowdfunding platforms, framing them not as a desperate last resort, but as an innovative and empowering technological solution. They applied the language of startup culture to a public health catastrophe. Consequence, this tech utopian narrative successfully hijacked the public conversation. It shifted the focus away from messy, difficult-to-solve policy failures and toward shiny, simple-to-understand tech solutions. It validated the core, brutal idea that our social safety net shouldn't be a government program, but a competitive marketplace of apps. My inner narrator wants to grab these people by their fleece vests and scream. They didn't disrupt a single goddamn thing. The hospital still charged you $10,000 for two Tylenol. The insurance company still denied your claim with a form letter. The patient was still sick, still terrified, and still broke. The only thing they disrupted was the quiet dignity of suffering. They didn't fix the disease. They built a beautiful, responsive, mobile-friendly website where you could describe your symptoms. And they took a 3% cut of any pity money you managed to raise. You can just picture the venture capital pitch deck. A slide almost certainly described the 28 million uninsured Americans, not as a policy failure, but as a $300 billion TAM of uncaptured medical spend. The presentation wouldn't be about patients. It would be about monthly active users. It wouldn't be about saving lives. It would be about optimizing the virality loop of tragic content and reducing friction in the donation funnel. It's the cold, amoral calculus of the spreadsheet, applied to the most vulnerable moments of human existence. This narrative was incredibly seductive because it offered an easy out. It told us we didn't need to have the hard, ugly political fights about taxes and regulation and social responsibility. The market would provide. A clever entrepreneur in a hoodie would solve it for us. Just download the app. It was a technological get-out-of-jail-free card for an entire society that refused to face its own failures. This rebranding of a systemic collapse as a heartwarming tech success story was a gift from heaven. For one group in particular, a group that desperately needed a way to talk about the healthcare crisis without ever having to take any responsibility for solving it. A group that was about to take this shiny new narrative and run with it all the way to the bank and to the ballot box. The politicians had found their perfect alibi. And the politicians, smelling an alibi, grabbed that shiny tech bro narrative with both hands and held it up like a holy relic for a certain flavor of elected official. The kind whose entire career is a balancing act between placating their angry constituents and serving their corporate donors. The rise of medical crowdfunding wasn't a crisis. It was a gift. It was the perfect, all-purpose rhetorical tool to deflect, dodge, and completely abdicate any and all responsibility for the waking nightmare of the American healthcare system. They developed a simple, brutally effective playbook. Step 1. Whenever you are confronted with a horrifying story of a citizen in your district who is about to lose their house to pay for their kid's medical bills, you must never, ever talk about policy. Do not mention insurance regulations. Do not mention drug pricing. Do not, under any circumstances, acknowledge that a systemic failure has occurred. Step 2. Wait for the inevitable GoFundMe campaign to launch. Then, you celebrate it, loudly, publicly. You get on Twitter. You go on local news. You issue a press release. You praise the unbelievable generosity of the community. You talk about the can-do spirit and the big hearts of the American people. You reframe the story. This is no longer a tragedy about a failed state. It is a triumphant epic of private charity and local heroism. Step 3. Offer your thoughts and prayers. This is the crucial finishing move. It is the political equivalent of putting up an automated out-of-office reply for a national emergency. It is a performance of empathy so hollow, so utterly devoid of any commitment to action, that it has become a dark joke. It is the sound of a politician washing their hands of a problem while trying to look like they care. This is the scandal of the great political dodge, the cynical weaponization of charity to maintain a cruel and profitable status quo. Cause: politicians, ideologically opposed to government solutions and heavily funded by the private healthcare industry, needed a powerful narrative to counter the growing evidence of a systemic crisis. Effect: they enthusiastically adopted the feel-good story of medical crowdfunding. They perfected the art of celebrating these campaigns as proof that private charity and community spirit are superior to any big government program. Consequence: this high-level political validation cemented the normalization of digital begging. It successfully shut down legislative debates about real reform by creating a false equivalency. Why would we need a functioning public safety net when our private, voluntary one is so inspiring? It was a national gaslighting campaign that told a drowning country that the real problem was a lack of bootstraps, not a lack of lifeboats. My inner narrator is just seething at the double-speak. Let's translate, shall we? When a politician praises the strong community, what they mean is the government I am a part of has completely and utterly failed you. When they talk about American generosity, what they mean is we have forced you to pay a voluntary, emergency tax on your compassion to cover the basic services we refuse to provide. And thoughts and prayers, that just means, please do not ask me to do my job. Here is your snapshot of the playbook in action. A senator stands at a podium and says, "I was just so moved last week to see the people of this great state raise over $300,000 to get little Sarah her life-saving treatment. It's a testament to our values. It shows that the true safety net is not in Washington, D.C., but in the heart of a neighbor." This, of course, is the same senator who, 2 months prior, voted to block the expansion of Medicaid that would have covered little Sarah's treatment in the first place. This rhetoric was insidious because it was so effective. It made anyone arguing for systemic change sound like a cynical, joyless scold. You want to talk about single-payer healthcare? Why are you trying to ruin this beautiful moment of community togetherness? You want to discuss drug price negotiation? Why do you hate charity? It was a political masterstroke, a way to be pro-suffering while sounding pro-people, and so the circle was complete. The failed economic system created the need. The tech brothers built the tool and branded it as innovation. The media sold the lie as inspiration. And now, the politicians were sanctifying the whole grotesque spectacle as a triumph of the national character, with all 4 pillars of the modern American power structure working in perfect, cynical harmony. The stage was set for the final act, a world where this entire nightmare was no longer a crisis, but was simply normal. And so, the final stage was reached. not with a bang, but with a collective, exhausted shrug. After years of the tech industry branding it as innovation, the media packaging it as inspiration, and the politicians sanctifying it as charity, the great normalization was complete. The crisis had become the climate. The spectacle of digital begging was no longer shocking or horrifying. It was just life. Asking for money online to fix your broken leg became as normal, as socially acceptable, and as utterly unremarkable as asking a friend to water your plants while you're on vacation. This wasn't a sudden event. It was a slow, creeping cultural shift. The kind you don't notice until it's already happened. It was the frog, slowly boiling in the pot. No longer aware that the water was ever cool, the evidence of this new normal was everywhere. Hiding in plain sight, it was in your social media feed. You would scroll, and the algorithm would serve you a seamless, surreal collage of modern American life, of friends' engagement photos, a targeted ad for a mattress, a funny meme about cats, a desperate plea to fund a stranger's cancer treatment, a video of a baby tasting a lemon for the first time. The plea for life-saving funds was given the same weight, the same digital real estate as everything else. It was just content. It was in our language. The phrase, "Well, I guess we'll have to start a GoFundMe," became a common, casual, almost darkly humorous response to any potential medical problem. It was no longer a statement of last-ditch desperation. It was step one in the financial planning process. It became a plot device in TV shows and movies, a relatable shorthand for a character facing a problem, treated with the same narrative weight as a car breaking down. The scandal here is the normalization itself. It is the quiet, society-wide acceptance of a completely broken social contract. Cause, the relentless, reinforcing messages from the media, the tech industry, and the political establishment successfully stripped medical crowdfunding of its power to shock. The constant exposure desensitized the public to the underlying horror, effect, the practice, became fully integrated into the fabric of American culture. The outrage at the need for these campaigns was replaced by a weary, practical resignation to their existence. The Overton window had been successfully shifted. Consequence: this normalization is the ultimate defense mechanism for the status quo. A problem that is considered normal no longer demands an urgent, systemic solution. It becomes a permanent, accepted feature of the landscape, an individual problem to be navigated rather than a collective crisis to be solved. It guarantees the indefinite survival of both the predatory healthcare system and the parasitic crowdfunding industry that feasts on its victims. My inner narrator is just tired. This is the end game. This is what happens when a society is successfully gaslighted into believing that a catastrophic failure is actually a quirky feature. We have, as a culture, developed a form of collective Stockholm syndrome. We have become so accustomed to the cruelty and absurdity of our healthcare system that we now view its most grotesque coping mechanisms as normal, even heartwarming traditions. Your Facebook feed is now the most honest record of our times. It has the standard, built-in life events you can post to your timeline. In a relationship, got married, started a new job, expecting a baby. And then there is the unofficial, user-generated life event that is just as common. Launched a GoFundMe for mom's experimental treatment. It's all just part of the journey now. We even developed a bizarre, unspoken etiquette for this new world. How much are you supposed to donate to a coworker's campaign? Is it rude if you see a friend's plea and don't share it? What is the appropriate emoji to react with when someone announces they need to raise $150,000 or they might die? We learned the social rules for navigating a dystopia because it was easier than admitting we lived in one. The normalization was so complete that the model was applied to every stage of life. There were GoFundMes for couples who couldn't afford IVF treatments to GoFund baby, whose very conception was crowdfunded. There were GoFundMes to pay for the funerals of people whose medical campaigns had failed. From a crowdfunded birth to a crowdfunded burial, the entire arc of American life was now a potential fund, raising opportunity. It was no longer a crisis. It was just the way things were. And if this is the new normal, if this entire horrifying system is now considered a standard feature of our society, what does that say about the system itself? So, what does it say about the system? It says that the system is the illness. The system is the tumor. The system is the pre-existing condition. And the patient is the entire country. The final, infuriating realization that clicks into place after watching this whole 15-year-long slow-motion catastrophe is that medical crowdfunding was never, ever the story. It was just the fever. It was the most visible, most photogenic, most tragically shareable symptom of a much deeper, much more malignant disease. The disease is a healthcare system that was never designed to heal people, but to extract wealth from them. A system built on the original sin of tying your survival to your job, ensuring that a pink slip could be a death sentence. A system so fragile that when the economy sneezed in 2008, millions were thrown into a medical abyss. Into that abyss stepped the tech platforms, the opportunistic saviors, who saw a market in the wreckage. They didn't build a lifeboat, they built a beautiful, user-friendly toll booth on the road to the bottom of the ocean and took a percentage of every desperate transaction. They were cheered on by a media machine, the feel-good industrial complex, that found it more profitable to sell inspiring stories of individual miracles than to report on the damning reality of a collective failure. This new, chaotic marketplace emboldened the old villains. The insurance companies, seeing the public was now willing to subsidize their denials, got even stingier, pushing millions into the purgatory of high-deductible plans that turned the insured into the functionally uninsured. The hospitals, seeing a new way to collect on their own absurd prices, started prescribing GoFundMe campaigns like it was an antibiotic. The politicians, the only people with the power to actually fix the underlying disease, saw the symptom and declared it a sign of robust health. They celebrated the charity to avoid having to write the policy. They offered thoughts and prayers to avoid offering legislation. And the final result of all these interlocking, self-serving systems was the great normalization. The moment when the fever became the new, accepted body temperature. This is the final, brutal chain of consequences. Cause a nation commits, against all evidence and all reason, to a for-profit, market-based system for a fundamental human right. Effect, that system inevitably fails the majority of its people, creating a crisis of access and affordability so vast that a parallel, parasitic, for-profit charity industry springs up to monetize. The desperation, consequence, the entire grotesque arrangement, the begging, the burnout, the misery Olympics. The lottery of survival becomes so commonplace that it ceases to be seen as a crisis. The symptom is mistaken for the cure, and the national conversation becomes about how to be a better fundraiser, not about how to build a country where you don't have to fundraise to live. We have built a country where it is easier to go viral than it is to see a doctor. That is the diagnosis. The people who donate are not the problem. Their generosity in the face of this systemic cruelty is a testament to the human spirit. The people who run the campaigns are not the problem. Their courage and resilience are astonishing. They are all just playing a rigged game on a burning field because it is the only game in town. The kindness of strangers is a beautiful, powerful thing, but it is a horrific foundation for a national public health policy. It is an unstable, inequitable, and soul-crushing substitute for a functioning society. The fact that medical crowdfunding exists at such a massive scale is the story about the power of the internet or the kindness of our hearts. It is an indictment. It is a siren. It is a sign that the entire system has failed, and that we have learned, tragically, to call the failure normal. The fever is raging, and we are all just getting used to the heat. So, in the end, the economy got its bailout and the American people got a tip jar for their own survival, and that's the deal we've all been living with ever since. Just a quick, legally mandated by our own paranoia reminder, this podcast is for entertainment purposes only. Please do not take our sarcastic, high-energy ranting as a substitute for actual financial, legal, or ethical advice. Reading a 50-page and user license agreement is still, regrettably, a better source for that than we are, though substantially less fun. We hope this deep dive into the chaos was at least a little illuminating, and maybe even cathartic. If there is another piece of modern madness you think is so absurd it needs the fact-check, simplified treatment, drop it in the comments below. We're always looking for the next thing that makes us ask, why is this still a thing? And that's how that whole mess went down. Until next time, don't trust the algorithm.